Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to my vegetable garden. Well, it's going to be another very hot day, so I'm out here relatively early in the morning while the temperatures are somewhat bearable. For those of you who aren't familiar with my videos, I live in Spokane, Washington. It is about 300 miles east of Seattle. We have a very dry climate, and this year we're experiencing an extreme drought, which is awful. And we've had some extremely high temperatures, up to 111 degrees Fahrenheit. That is atrocious. The Spokane area is in USDA hardiness zone 6. But our garden is in a bit of a microclimate, so it's kind of about zone 5B, just to give you a reference. Now, each month during the growing season, I like to shoot what I call the virtual vegetable garden tour, so you can see how the plants are progressing. And if you haven't seen my May and June virtual vegetable garden tours, be sure to go to my YouTube channel so you can see how they started out. So let's get started. Our vegetable garden is comprised of 27 raised beds. Yes, 27. And I'm not bragging about it, I'm just saying we love raised bed gardening so much, and so that's how we've chosen to grow our veggies. So I'm going to take you row by row through the garden. I'll try not to make this video very long though, because I want to keep it interesting. So this first bed, which has been covered until a moment ago with floating row cover, is where I'm growing beets and Swiss chard. Now I'm going to be completely honest with you. I have not looked under this cover for a few weeks, and that's mainly because it has been so incredibly hot. My time in the garden has been very limited, and boy is that frustrating for a passionate gardener. But the plants are doing really well. I do see one little problem, and I want to show that to you up close. If you look closely on this Swiss chard leaf, you see some big holes. I'm pretty sure that is slug damage, which is really annoying. And of course, I have planted this bed very intensely, and that means it can be tricky to deal with things like slugs. But in this case, I'm just going to pull off this leaf and put it into the compost pile. Now, if you're wondering why I have used this cover over the bed, that's because beets, spinach, and Swiss chard all get leaf miners. The adult is a fly. It lays eggs on the leaves. The maggots hatch and they tunnel between the layers of cells in the leaves, and they cause so much damage. So by using this row cover, I keep the flies away from the leaves on the plants so they can't lay eggs. So it acts as a physical barrier to keep them off of the plants. And that is a great strategy, especially for a plant that doesn't need to be pollinated. None of these need to be pollinated. So I can keep this over the plants for the entire season, except for harvesting or weeding. In this bed, I'm growing a row of Bulgarian giant leeks. You can see that they're doing great. They will be huge by the time harvest time comes around. And then there's also a few rows of some onions, and they are also doing really well. We've been harvesting some for cooking because you know you can harvest onions throughout the season, and that still works great. This next bed is our covered lettuce bed. And I'm going to show you the inside. You're going to be shocked, but once again, because it has been so hot, the lettuce bolted to seed, some weeds got going. We have some wasps in there, and I've been kind of scared to go in and try to clean it out, but I do want to reseed the lettuce crop and see if we can get going again. But it might still be too hot to do that, so that's why I haven't jumped on the project. Okay, I'm opening this with a little bit of trepidation. I should clarify real quickly that this covered raised bed is part of a DIY project that's in my new book, The Vegetable Garden Pest Handbook. And it is a method for, again, acting as a physical barrier to keep certain types of pests away. Now, in this case, I covered the lettuce bed early this spring because the birds like to nibble on the leaves. So that's why the cover is here. But this would work great also for plants that do not require pollination. So again, things like beets, spinach, Swiss chard, cabbage family crops such as broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale, kohlrabi, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to open this. Hopefully I'll be safe. And you'll see what a jungle it is in here. Isn't that nuts? So yeah, there are some sorrel plants that went to seed. Some dill plants, of all things, which have not been planted in this bed, came up. And I'm thinking they were in the compost pile. So that's how we ended up with them there. But there's a few lettuce plants that have gone to seed. They're very bitter. I've got some catmint in here somehow. It's amazing what got started, but I do want to clean this all up and replant the bed. I did let this dill plant go to flower here because it is a great attractor of beneficial insects. So yeah, it's looking a little crazy in there, and it's on my list. Now we still have a bit of early morning shade covering this bed, but I think you can see it well enough. So this is the carrot bed, and as I mentioned in my last video about flowers in the vegetable garden, some of the carrot plants went to seed. That is extremely unusual, but it's because of our very high temperatures. So most of the ones that went to seed are the Uzbek golden carrots that I planted. I've never grown this variety before, but the vast majority of the ones that did not tolerate the heat were that one. I do see this one has also bolted, and that is, I can't read it, Tonda. So, you know, this year it's anybody's guess. But the reason I'm leaving them in place rather than pulling them out is because, just like with the dill, which is in the same plant family, carrots attract all sorts of beneficial insects. And so I thought, you know, why not? Why don't I just let them flower, attract the beneficials, and we'll call that good. But I do want to try to plant another crop of carrots. As you can see, the next two beds are empty. In the foreground, that bed had the pea crop. They grew well for us, they produced well for us, but once the heat came along, they said, nah, we're done, we don't like that heat one bit. And so what I did is, instead of pulling the plants up out of the soil, I clipped them off right at the soil level and just took away the greens, if you will. I wanted to leave the roots in the soil because, of course, they fix nitrogen in the soil, and I thought that would be very beneficial for the next crop that we plant in there. The bed in the background is where the garlic and shallots grew, and we harvested them a couple of weeks back. So I'm just waiting for some decent weather to plant more beets and Swiss chard, more carrots, and more lettuce. In this bed we're growing lots and lots of onions. There are a couple of rows of Stuttgarter. That's a great onion that keeps for a long time in storage. And then there's also a red onion in here called Red of Florence. We have harvested some of those and they're delicious. And as they've been growing, we are harvesting every other onion. That's the game plan, so that anything that's remaining has more room to develop a larger bulb. Now, how do you know when onions are finished growing for the season? What will happen is the stems of the majority of them will just flop over right down near the top of the bulb. And that means they're done. So when that happens, you need to turn off the water to the bed or stop watering the bed if you're hand watering. And then you're going to pull them, put them somewhere that is out of the weather and dry and cool, basically, to let them dry so that you can keep them in storage later. Now, speaking of onions, here's another onion bed, and you'll notice it looks completely different from the last bed. We have different varieties of onions growing in here, and the majority of the stems have fallen over, signaling that they're finished growing. There is nothing we can do at this point to make them grow longer. So we're going to pull them up and do what I was mentioning. However, I do want to point out that the bulbs on these onions are way smaller. I think that that has happened partly because of the horrible heat that we've been experiencing, but there's also potentially another factor, and that is next to the bed we have a rather large hedge. Maybe it cast more shade than I think it did, but I have to tell you, that hedge is on the north side of the garden, and so in theory it really shouldn't be casting much shade. So we're kind of scratching our heads over this one, but you know, there's nothing we can do about it. We'll just harvest them and enjoy them as small onion bulbs. In this next bed, which I showed you in my last video, that's where I'm growing dahlias, and I also poked in a few sunflower plants because I thought it would be great to have those flowers in the garden. Well, it is great to have them in the garden. However, they have been shading the dahlias a bit, which I absolutely did not take into account. That was a mistake on my part. But I did have someone suggest that I trim off some of the lower leaves of the sunflower plants, which I did yesterday, so I'm hoping that will help. This bed has an interesting mix of plants in it, and it's mainly because I needed somewhere to put them. So this is a grape tomato called Pandorino. I've never grown it before, but it is producing all sorts of tomatoes, so that is very encouraging. These are big duck yellow marigolds, which I started from seed. I mentioned them also in my previous video. They are an awesome marigold to have anywhere in your garden. And then I've got a couple of artichokes. So the artichokes are kind of an interesting story. Because we live in a cold zone where we have very cold winters, we tend to grow artichokes as annual plants. And the thing is that under ideal situations, they like to grow the first year and start producing the next. Well, I know a trick called vernalization, and that's where you put the seeds in the refrigerator for a period of time before you start them indoors. And then about 2 weeks before you can plant the seedlings out in the garden, once the danger of frost has passed, you also expose them to cold temperatures without letting them get frosted. And what happens is it makes the plants think they've already been through a winter, so they go right into production that first year. That works great, especially in a cold climate. So let me show you the little artichokes that are growing on them so far. Here's the first one. And here's the second one. As a matter of fact, I even see a little baby one on the side here. Oh boy, I love artichokes. Now, as I always say, here is everybody's favorite part of our garden. So this is our pole bean arbor. I have Musica pole beans growing on it, and the arbor is made up of a series of 4 trellises or arches that are spaced a few inches apart. The pole beans grow up and over, and ordinarily they produce great. Now this year, because of the extreme heat, it happened much earlier than usual, and of course higher temperatures than we usually get. So the timing was awful. Ordinarily I would be harvesting massive bowls of beans, and I've harvested very few. The encouraging thing is that I'm seeing a bunch of flowers on the vines now, and so I think they're kind of bouncing back. So fingers crossed. On the north side of the arbor, I have a sunflower that is going nuts. I've got some onions because I had spare onion sets, and then I also have some celery growing. I always plant the celery on the north side of the arbor because they get a little bit more filtered light, and it seems like they grow better when they have that. I've also got some nasturtiums in here. This is the south side of the bean arbor, and I have a combination of things growing in here. I've got some basil plants, I've got some onions, I've got some zinnias, and I made a silly mistake. I know a lot of you think that I don't make gardening mistakes. Oh yeah, I make plenty of them. And my mistake here was I had an extra pumpkin seedling and I thought, oh, I'll just plant it in here. It won't be a problem. Well, of course, it has grown all over the place. I do have a very nice pumpkin growing right here. It's about this big. So that's good. But, you know, that was not a good decision. I should have either given someone the extra seedling or put it in the compost pile. Oh well. Here's the other arch in our garden. We made it with cattle panels. Sometimes they're called livestock panels. And so there's one here that goes up and over, and here's the other one. So 2 panels. And what I did is I planted winter squash in here to grow up and over. They're doing pretty well. This one has made it up to here. And what I planted are potimarron winter squash. I'll show you some close-ups. Also some butternut squash, which I have not seen any butternut squash developing. There's also some pumpkins in here. So let me show you a couple of close-ups. But this is a really slick way to grow winter squash because instead of having it trail all over the garden, I've got it going up and over. My goal has been for the arbor to be completely filled. I just don't know if that's going to happen this year, but we'll see. So here is a potimarron squash. It will get maybe about this big. It's going to have bright orange-red skin, and the flesh is quite thick. It's delicious, and it's quite prolific. I grew this last year for the first time, and I was really happy with it. Here's a pumpkin. That is a New England pie pumpkin, and it is doing really great. Hey, I just discovered my first butternut squash. Nice. This time of day, the squash blossoms are just buzzing with bees. It's so cool. Now it's time for a quick peek inside our little hoop house. If you haven't seen it before, it's something that my husband Bill and I built several years ago. And if you want to learn more about it, just go to my blog, susansinthegarden.com, and do a search on the words Hoop House Project. So it is covered with a greenhouse grade of plastic. It is 10 feet wide by 9 feet long, so it fits over 2 of our raised beds. So let me show you what we're growing in here this time of year. In one of the beds, we're growing Tuscan Napoli cantaloupes, and there are already some young melons developing in there. So I'll show you a close-up of that in just a moment. In the other bed, for the very first time ever in the Mulvihill garden, we're growing sweet potatoes and a few extra peppers. And that's a catbird, in case you're wondering what that sound is. So we figured that because sweet potatoes love the warmth, they probably should do well in the hoop house, so we will see. The other thing I wanted to mention is during the fall and winter months, I grow super cold tolerant veggies, things like kale, lettuce, spinach, corn salad, and miner's lettuce. Here is a young cantaloupe. And there's another one back here. There's about 6 growing so far, but I'm hoping for even more. These next 3 beds have tomatoes growing in them, so you can see there, and in the background. And they have been reacting differently to the heat, so I want to show you that real quickly. This first bed is doing reasonably well. The first plant is Chef's Choice Orange. It's my favorite slicing tomato. And yes, it will be a bright orange. I do have maybe half a dozen of them developing on here, maybe a little bit more than that, so I feel very encouraged. The next plant is Costaluto Genovese, and that is an heirloom. I've been very excited to grow it for the first time this year. I would say there's about maybe 6 or 7 tomatoes growing on there, and I'm okay with that. I'm not totally alarmed. So waiting to see how those do. There's actually 3 of those plants in this bed. There's also another Pandarino grape tomato in here. It has quite a lot of tomatoes growing on it. A couple of them have turned red, so I've already eaten them. And so this first bed is sort of okay, but let me show you the next two. The next two beds have paste tomatoes growing in them. And when I say paste, what I mean is they are the meaty types of tomatoes, not super juicy, that are great for making things like tomato sauce, salsa, and ketchup. So I have Federle and Gilberti paste tomatoes growing in this bed that you're looking at and the bed directly behind it. But it's much easier to see this close bed so that I can show you what I'm talking about. So here's what I'm seeing on the tomato plants in both of these beds. The foliage looks pretty sad. It's kind of a little bit wilty, but just not growing well or normally. There are very few flowers. I see one right here. And maybe like 2 paste tomatoes developing on the plants. By this time of year, these plants should be covered with at least young tomatoes. I'm not seeing that at all, and so that is very worrisome. Now what we did, because we could tell the plants were struggling, is we had a long piece of shade cloth, and so we put it above the 3 different tomato beds, trying to give them a little bit of protection from the intensity of the sun because it was so incredibly hot. The plants obviously did not tolerate the heat well, and it's true that tomato plants have kind of a range of temperatures during which they will bloom normally and set fruit normally. Well, we didn't have that because the temperatures that we experienced, well over 100 degrees, occurred in late June. That is so early, and it was so hot. Now let me show you one other thing because you might find it interesting and it might be something you would see on your tomato plants at different times of the season. This might be a bit hard for you to see. I'm going to try to put my hands behind it so you can see this more clearly. Do you see how the leaves on this tomato plant are curling upward? That is something that's called physiological leaf roll. It is not a disease, it is a reaction to the weather. Now usually a gardener would see this in spring. Let's say temperatures were just fine when you planted them, and then all of a sudden you have a little bit of a cold snap, not a frost, but just cooler weather. The plants will curl as a reaction to the weather, and then when the temperatures become more normal, they'll go back to their regular shape. So I'm seeing a lot of this on the tomato plants, and what it's telling me is, no, it wasn't reacting to cold weather, but it sure is reacting to the heat. It's really a shame. And I keep waiting for our temperatures to get more seasonal and see the plants get back to growing normally. It's very frustrating. Okay, I'll try to pick up the pace now. So this next bed is filled with 3 Cocozelle zucchini plants that are producing like nobody's business, and also 2 Goldilocks bush acorn plants. So I want to show you the Goldilocks ones since they're more unusual. Okay, here you go. Look at that. So again, this is a bush form rather than a vining form of acorn squash. And I love that idea because it will not take up very much space in the garden. I mean, the plant is basically like so. So I think that's pretty cool. So here's where we're growing all of our potatoes. We have a raised bed that is filled with potato plants, and we also have 5 different containers that we're growing potatoes in. Some of them, 3 to be precise, are cloth grow bags. You probably can't even see them because of all the stuff in the way. And then 2 are large plastic containers. The plants are doing great. I was sure that they would not tolerate this heat, and for some reason they did okay. This is our corn patch, and I don't know what to tell you about it. The last time I did a video tour, I showed you that it was way beyond knee-high by the 4th of July. And that was cool. The plants were just exploding into growth. And then the heat happened and it's like it just stopped them. Some of the leaves on the top are just crispy brown, very dry. And we just don't know what to expect as far as a harvest goes. They did tassel, so that means that ears can potentially be pollinated, but we honestly are not sure what kind of a harvest we're going to get, and it's that darned heat again. I will say it's encouraging to see an ear forming here, and I see one on the plant right behind it. So I would be very happy if we ended up with a normal harvest, but again, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. This is our broccoli bed, and you can see that I've got shade cloth over it. I actually put the shade cloth on about 3 or 4 weeks ago because I know broccoli plants don't like a lot of heat. So far it seems to be working well. We also gave them extra water. I did harvest the main heads of broccoli off of all of the plants. I was just checking them. I do see some secondary heads forming, which are the smaller ones around the perimeter of where the main head originally was. So that's encouraging. You can see there's a secondary head forming right here, and they won't get very large, so I probably should go ahead and harvest that. If you're wondering why this netting is here, that is to keep the cabbage butterflies, cabbage looper moths, and diamondback moths away from the plants so they can't lay eggs. This is Bill's pepper bed, and also with a few onions thrown in. And the plants are doing better than when I last did a virtual vegetable garden tour. They are producing a lot of peppers, but they're not anywhere near as robust as they usually are when he grows them in the hoop house. This is the first year he has grown them outside of the hoop house in quite a while, and I'm thinking he's going to want the hoop house back for next year. But the plants are doing okay. We did cover the bed with shade cloth during the high temperatures, and that seemed to help them out quite a bit, and we did give them extra water. And last but not least, the final bed has, surprise, more onions in it. As I explained last month, I got this great deal on a bunch of onion sets, and then when I received them, it was like, oh my gosh, this is way more than I thought there would be. So yeah, we're growing a lot of onions this year. We're not complaining because we love to use onions in cooking, and anything that we can't use, we'll definitely donate to the food bank. I should probably do a quick update on how our green stock vertical garden is doing, and it is doing great. So at the top, I've got some flowers. I've got calendulas. This is zeolites. This is a beautiful bicolor profusion zinnia called red yellow. These are attracting pollinators, which is great. The next row of pockets has strawberries. We've been eating some. They're just delicious. The next row down is mellow yellow bush beans, and we've been harvesting quite a few. I see a very nice one here that I better pick. Down below it, I have jalapeno peppers, and the plants are just covered with them. That is cool. And then the bottom row has eggplants in it. And, you know, after I planted them, I thought, you know, maybe that's not a very good idea because they will have pretty heavy fruits on them. But I've seen and heard of people planting tomatoes in here, and I thought if they can plant tomatoes, I can plant eggplants. So this will be an experiment for me. But this is on a caster setup, so I can spin it around if I want. You can see how well everything is doing. And the plants have done exceptionally well during this heat wave. Although I will say that just like with all kinds of containers, they have dried out quickly, so I need to water them in the morning and the evening. But that is completely to be expected for containers. I think that they have plenty of soil to grow in, and I mean, seeing is believing. You can see how well they're doing, so I'm very pleased. Okay, it is way too hot, so I'm going back indoors. I hope you enjoyed this video tour of the vegetable garden. I'm sorry it was a little bit on the long side, but there was so much to talk about this time. Overall, the garden is doing well. It's certainly grown a lot since you last saw it. And we just have to wait and see how this all plays out with the effect of the extreme temperatures on some of the vegetable crops. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll see you next week. Happy gardening!